I'm going to start this talk about my book with a mention that I love this cover, and I had nothing to do with it, so I think I can say this that I love this cover. And one of the reasons I love it is that flame, which speaks, I think, to the creative fire of people like Prince Demah, the Black American artist I'm going to speak about today, and how artists are so absolutely integral to political protest and revolution across time and space. I also love this cover because one of my hobbies is embarrassing my Gen Z children. And when the designer sent this to me, I sent it to them on a text message, a group text, and I was like, guys, my cover is so fire. And they were like, oh my God, never say that again, Mom. So, of course, I've been saying it all the time. And it's been delightful to see them get embarrassed in person when I give this talk. On the one occasion, my daughter was actually in the audience. But more seriously, I do like that it speaks to, I think, the power of art to play roles in politics, and the role of artists like Prince Demah to keep that fire burning that inspires people to do the dramatic work necessary to engage in widespread political protest, revolution, and the forging of a new nation. So I'm going to begin with a broader look at the book, just to situate us in it before I zoom in on Prince Demah. And I'm going to begin with not Massachusetts, where Prince Demah lived most of his life, except for the time he was in London, but with London. And I'm going to begin in an unlikely place for the American Revolution, and that is the Royal Academy of Art. And you could picture the scene here. This is what it would have looked like in 1780, which is the year I'm beginning my opening anecdote in. As you can get a sense of from the dimensions of the people versus the room itself, this room is massive. It's 32 feet tall from floor to ceiling, and it was absolutely crammed with paintings in this 18th century gallery hang style. Hundreds of paintings literally crowded the walls. And so 1780 was an important year because it was the first year that the Royal Academy of Art was held in this new building. This new building was built because it had the royal patronage of King George III and Queen Charlotte. New portraits by American artist Benjamin West were unveiled that year, including this one of Queen Charlotte. And so the king and queen were there themselves in portrait form. They were also there physically to unveil the exhibition. And the reason I emphasize this is because this was also the year that the debut entry of an American artist who was born in New Jersey, Joseph Wright, one of the first Americans to study at the Royal Academy, had his debut painting entry. And this is important because you can't just roll in and decide to slap a painting on the wall of the Royal Academy. It is a juried selection, so a group of judges get together and decide which paintings are good enough to hang. And this was his first entry, so it was a big deal. And as you can see, even though there are hundreds of paintings in the show, that year his painting makes an absolute splash, and it was one of the most widely remarked upon. Now, what his entry showed, and I can't show you the actual painting because more on that in a minute, it is lost to us, but what it showed was his famous mother, Patience Wright, who spent many years of her life in Bordenton, New Jersey. And what you saw was her modeling a head on her lap in this portrait by her son. Now, she was famous for the way she modeled these heads in wax that she created and put in her very popular London Wax Museum. She allegedly, when she modeled from life, the subject would be sitting in front of her and she would be chatting them up the entire time she was modeling their head. But she would be modeling the head under her skirt. And then she would whip it out fully formed and, to the astonishment of the person or the people watching. And obviously this was more than a little bit suggestive of giving birth. It had some sexual connotations. And it was one of many things that made her very famous. Her image was famous. This is an image from 1775 that circulated in a popular London magazine. And so when her son created this portrait of her modeling a head in this fashion and hung it on the wall of Royal Academy, everyone knew exactly who she was. They also knew by 1780 that she was rumored correctly to be a spy for the American patriots, using her London Wax Museum to run an international spy ring. And the reason that her son's portrait of her made such a splash was not just because she was an American spy who created wax figures in titillating fashion, but because what she modeled on her head was the decapitated head of King Charles I, who was England's king, of course, famously beheaded by his own subjects during the English Civil War. So this was a portrait of regicide, and because it also showed busts of King George and Queen Charlotte looking down at her work, it also was the portrait of the threat of future regicide. And bear in mind, their majesties are at the show, undoubtedly seeing this painting, and it created an absolute sensation. But what really stunned me when I came across discussion of it in the archives of the Royal Academy is that this is 5 years after the Battle of Lexington and Concord kicks things off, 5 years into the war. It's the Royal Academy in London. The king and queen are there. So you would assume, first of all, that this painting would never make it into the show at all. You also might assume that people who saw it thought that it was treasonous and an insult to decency and needed to be removed. And this does happen in some of the newspaper reactions and private correspondence about it. But other people go on record in newspapers as well as private letters saying that this is an entertaining defense of constitutional liberties and that the Americans have got it right, that the Britons are the ones who are disregarding the constitutional liberties guaranteed by things like the Magna Carta. And Joseph Wright is right. And his mother is right, and we should support our American brethren in their cause. So this just really hit me, the fact that the clashing opinions on it and the fact it was in the Royal Academy at all 5 years into the armed conflict reminds us that the war we now call the American Revolution was fought on both sides of the Atlantic, and that artists as well as soldiers were vital in forming who took what sides in the courts of public opinion as well as on the battlefield. And one of the reasons that Prince Demah's life is so inspiring and interesting to me is that he encapsulates all elements of the American revolutionary spirit. He is an artist as well as a soldier. He's North America's first identifiable enslaved portrait painter. He also enlists to fight for the Massachusetts militia in the 1770s. So his story, I think, tells us these stories about how individual Americans are inspired by the American ideals of liberty to fight on behalf of the emerging nation and to use art as well as arms to do so. And he, of course, is someone, as I'll detail in a few minutes, who is able to become a professional portrait painter in part because he trains in London. And he trains with a man who also has exhibited at the Royal Academy. So before I get into more details about Prince Demah, I want to tell you what happened to the portrait of Mrs. Wright modeling the decapitated head of Charles I, because I think it is an important reminder of the fact that what is in museums today, what is in historic sites, is only a tiny fraction of what was once created and seen. That art, like many things, buildings don't always survive the havoc of history. Art doesn't always survive the havoc of history. This is one reason preservation efforts are so important. It's also one reason that it's important that we think about whose art is not in the museums, whose stories are not told in our books about history and our historic sites. Because what's preserved in our museums today is only a tiny bit of what was once created and seen. Wright's portrait of his mother, for example, only survives in the archives, the documents that I've quoted today, and that is because it likely was lost at sea. So in 1781, Joseph Wright, who around the time that his portrait was hung in the Royal Academy, published this self-portrait of himself, really leaning into his pro-American politics despite living in the center of London. You can see he styled himself Yankee Doodle or the American Satan in this self-portrait. Joseph Wright decides that the political waters are a little too hot for him in London, and so he leaves London for Paris. The Wright's good family friend is Benjamin Franklin, who is in Paris, of course, at the time. Franklin helps Joseph Wright get passage on a ship bound for Boston called the Argo. And Wright is going to Boston because he's gotten this really plum commission to create a model of the head of George Washington to be sent to Europe to create the first huge statue of Washington to celebrate his role as commander-in-chief. So 10 weeks into this journey, on the last few days at sea, the ship approaches the Maine coast and it runs aground on a pile of rocks. And although the passengers managed to make it ashore, much of the cargo, including Wright's paintings, including the one of his mother holding the decapitated head of Charles I, was lost and washed out of the ship's hold and sunk below the waves. But the reason I emphasize this story is because I think that even though his portrait of his mother holding that decapitated head of Charles I sunk under the Atlantic and it's physically lost, it offers an invaluable window into the revolutionary past, into the role of people like Joseph Wright and Prince Demah, who fought for American independence on both sides of the Atlantic. It also, I think, is a metaphor for how we can use history and how we can use art. Because much as we can dive to retrieve shipwrecked things from the bottom of the sea, we can tell histories that allow us to see previously submerged stories about the past. People like Prince Demah, who would not have been discussed in a history book 50 years ago. And just because these people, like this art, are submerged or hidden below the waves doesn't mean they're not there. And what I do in The Painter's Fire is bring these revolutionary portraits, both things and people, up from the depths of the past and into the light. And what it traces for us is a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution and the creative people who made it that transforms the way I hope that we think of the nature of patriotism and what a founder looks like and what weapons they used to fight with then and now. So I'm going to now shift focus to Prince Demah. And he is one of these artists at the heart of this story of these forgotten artistic patriots who shaped the revolution through their art and their passion and their commitment to the cause. They're all in London at some point. Many of them never leave London. Patience Wright never leaves London and operates as an American spy throughout the war. Prince Demah is one of the people who goes back and forth. And what I love about his story is maybe a little snapshot into how I came to this project to begin with. He is someone who would not be in the pantheon of great artists or great historical figures from the Revolution as we have long conceived of it. And I first stumbled across him in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the portrait that you see on the left is hanging. And this is in the American wing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and probably familiar with the marquee painting that anchors the gallery when you sort of look down the rooms at the end, which is the 19th century painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which you see here on the right. Absolutely enormous painting, epic, legendary, really brings home the struggle of the American Revolution. Also completely mythologized. Anyone who spends any time on boats knows, for example, you don't stand up in the bow of a ship when it's crossing the river. And but it's this inspiring painting, right? And the American Gallery is filled with these inspiring paintings linked to early America and the Revolutionary era. Now, this portrait by Prince Demah is tucked away, sort of off to the side, a very unassuming spot in the galleries. It's pretty small. It's only about this big. It's kind of dwarfed by these epic paintings. And yet, when I read the label attached to it, I thought this is one of the most inspiring stories of the American Revolution and the people who made it that I've ever heard. And as I overheard someone near me say, this sounds like the plot of a movie, and I 100% agreed. So, if you're a producer, get in touch. But what it told was the story of Prince Demah, who is born into slavery in Massachusetts to a mother who was stolen from Africa as a young girl and brought to Boston and ended up living the rest of her life in Massachusetts. And her son, Prince Demah, is separated from her at a young age, and she is working very hard for years to get them back together, which she finally does because he's a very talented artist, and she convinces the people who have her enslaved that they should cultivate his talent. This is not the way the label at the Met pitches this. The way the label at the Met pitches this is that Prince Demah's enslavers, Henry and Christian Barnes, and I'll tell you more about them in the course of this talk, that they decided to cultivate his talent and took him to London so he could get professional training. That is true, but it was Prince Demah and his mother who really were the ones pushing his talent onto them. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book and to center Prince Demah was to think about the fact that this is a man who would have had a much better chance finding freedom with the British than he did with the Americans, and yet he stayed and fought with the American militia when his loyalist enslavers fled the country. And he left behind only three paintings that we know of, but he shows in this one of these, this surviving painting right here, I think, a real talent at engaging with 18th century ideals of portrait painting. And I just think this painting is amazing, and I think you can really. This subject is a Boston merchant called William Duguid, and I think his pose and his gaze is just amazing. So what I was inspired to do in this project was to say, what would it look like if we looked at the art of the American Revolution and we looked at the people we're not used to looking at? So people like Benjamin West and John Trumbull and John Singleton Copley and Charles Wilson Peale are all in this book, but they're secondary characters. Instead, I'm looking at the sort of forgotten patriot artists like Prince Demah and the man he went to London to train with, Robert Edge Pine, as well as Patience Wright and her son. So the sort of maverick figures of the artistic world of the American Revolution. And the other reason that I came to be inspired to write about these people is that when I did some digging, they are connected with many other famous people, including Phillis Wheatley. And the book's title, in fact, is inspired by the Phillis Wheatley poem To S.M., a Young African Painter on Seeing His Works, in which she has this line, "Still may the painters and the poets fire, to aid thy pencil and thy verse conspire." And my editor and I thought that the painter's fire really encapsulates how Phillis Wheatley and Prince Demah and these other creative people who are using their art to document and inspire protest in the American Revolution really do change our conception of the American Revolution. Remind us that there were Black women and men, as well as white men like George Washington, who were all living in this world together, creating this culture of American politics, protest, and eventually the young nation. So the three people at the heart of this are Prince Demah, who I've just introduced to you, and his portrait of his enslaver, Christian Barnes, is there on the left. That's at the Hingham Historical Society. That's the second of the three portraits of his that survive. Christian Barnes was one of the people most invested in Prince Demah getting professional training. She thought that he could, and he did, become a professional portrait painter, despite the fact that they lived in colonial Massachusetts. And the person that she eventually sent him to London to train with, is Robert Edge Pine. And Robert Edge Pine is this award-winning British artist who's well connected to court and academy and all the sort of high art things in London. And what you see in the middle is his portrait of George II. Now, obviously, the fact that he has a portrait of George II shows you he's well connected. But I also want to point out the fact that this is one of the most flattering portraits of George II, who had these famously sort of bulgy eyes and was not very appealing. And this is not. This is something that is, George II is not looking very kingly in this portrait, I think, despite his rich garb. And I think this hints at the fact that Robert Edge Pine was someone who was very egalitarian. He was a radical Whig in terms of his own politics. And during the American Revolution, despite the fact that he was a well-connected, well-off British person, he came to become devoted to the American cause. And I think his political views are one of the reasons why he agreed to train this enslaved would-be professional painter from Massachusetts. And then on the right is another image of Patience Wright, the wax sculptor, styled as Liberty. She's holding a Liberty cap, which is an international symbol of revolution in this point in time, and freedom. And so this book connects the three of them together. And all this is just to preface that this is the world that Prince Demah finds himself in, and he's embroiled with these people who run museums in London. Robert Edge Pine, after the war, will emigrate to America and open the first big art museum in America in Philadelphia. And so Prince Demah is connected with all of these sort of really grand artistic communities in London when he trains there, which is amazing and somewhat unprecedented for an enslaved artist from colonial Massachusetts. So I would like to give a little bit of homage to his talents, because if you look at this portrait, it certainly looks more what we used to call folk art, like the grand history paintings of Washington crossing the Delaware or things like that. I've already said that I love this painting. One of the reasons I love it is that It shows off the fact that Prince Demah is really smart and clever and able to use 18th century symbolism to announce a lot of things about who the man in his portrait is. So in the 18th century, people could look at a portrait and read it like we would read the words on a t-shirt. And I'm not exaggerating. This is something that people were well trained in, almost like what the smiley face meme means if you get it on a text message. 18th century people would look at this portrait and knew what some of the symbolism meant in much that same immediate way. This is a merchant who lives in Boston but is from Scotland. He trades in global textiles. What he's wearing is a dressing gown, as they called it in the 18th century, that is an Indian chintz. So it shows that he is engaged in global trade. He is wearing a dressing gown because you wear a dressing gown if you have the money to sit around and read books. And what does Demah show behind him? But a lot of books in his costly, of the latest style bookcase behind him. He also shows that he's Scottish because what he's wearing is a brooch that's called a witch's heart or Lukenbooth, and that was something that immediately signaled Scotland to people who had it. It also, because it's made out of red garnets, is a symbol of love and affection. And I do think the family loved this painting because they kept the painting and the brooch, which you see there, is on display at the Met alongside the portrait. So it descended in the family. Prince Demah, I think, was also very proud of this painting because he signed it on the back. One of the few ways we know he was literate. And I'd like to call attention to the way he signs his name. Prince Demah, and then Barnes, very little tiny Barnes. The Prince Demah is what's important. And in fact, once he self-emancipates, when his enslavers, the Barneses, flee the country, because of various attacks against them, which I'm going to go into in a minute, he drops the Barnes and retains the Prince Demah. So this portrait tells us a lot about Prince Demah and his sophisticated grasp of art. It also tells us a lot about its sitter, Dogood. And I emphasize the names here because I think that we should begin to think about Prince Demah not as the Metropolitan Museum of Art frames him as the enslaved property of Henry Barnes, who then decides to give him some art training, but as Daphne's son. So his mother, Daphne, was much like Phillis Wheatley, born in Africa and stolen from Africa as a young girl and brought to Massachusetts. And Daphne never forgot she was African. In all the documentation that she has to file after the American Revolution, she's destitute and she's trying to get money from the state. And she always emphasizes that she is from Africa, although she's lived in Massachusetts for years at this point. She names her son Prince Demah, which is very unusual. Enslaved people usually are only given one name, and they're usually given those names by their enslavers. This is one of the awful things that happens in slavery. Daphne almost certainly was not named Daphne in Africa. This is how she's renamed by her enslavers in Massachusetts. But what she might have been named is Demah, because Demah is a West African name. It is both a girl's first name and a surname. We don't know if it was Daphne's first name or her last name, but she keeps it, and she gives it to her son, whom she names Prince Demah. And even though for a while they are called Daphne Barnes and Prince Demah Barnes, later on when the Barneses flee and they self-emancipate, they both become Demahs, is their surname, Daphne Demah and Prince Demah. And I think that Daphne is really the one who is pushing for her son to have an extraordinary life despite the fact that he is enslaved. She is the one who brings up the fact that her son is a talented artist to Christian Barnes. So not long after Christian Barnes married Henry Barnes, Prince Demah was a very young child at this point. Probably, we're not sure, but probably around 4 or 5. We don't know who his father is. Christian Barnes has him sent away, and he probably is enslaved by her brother. What we do know for sure is that he then spends years apart from his mother in his childhood, boyhood, and young adulthood because he is enslaved in a different household in Massachusetts where he is sent off to have a career as a sailor. He works as a mariner for many years. Daphne is not happy about this, which is quite understandable, of course. And she makes it very clear to the Barneses that she does not like being separated from her son. She does not like being enslaved. And eventually this pans out in her saying, look, you should really emancipate my son from your brother and enslave him yourself because he's a really talented artist and he could have this interesting artistic career for you. And so she has Prince Demah come and visit and show off his skills. And in fact, what ends up happening is that Christian Barnes says, you know what, he is amazing and I would love to have him come live in my household and train him to be an artist. And so they purchase Prince Demah and he comes back to the house in Marlborough with his mother. And Christian Barnes writes that Daphne appears to be much better reconciled to a state of slavery since her son's arrival. Upon the whole, I believe there's not a happier set of black people in any kitchen in the province. And Christian Barnes, of course, did not use the phrase black people. She used another phrase that I'm not going to repeat here. But so I find this extraordinary because Daphne has successfully persuaded her enslaver to buy back her son so that they can live together and so that she can cultivate his artistic talent. And in fact, this is what Christian Barnes does. She has him copy paintings. On the left, you see the copy of Christian Barnes's portrait by John Singleton Copley, which Prince Demah made in the early 1770s. And on the right, you see a painting of Henry Barnes, who's the husband of the couple, that Prince Demah created. And that's the third of his known paintings that survives. We also know he did other paintings. We know he did a self-portrait. We know he did another copy of a Copley of one of Christian Barnes's dear friends, and many other portraits that are now just only left in these, little mentions, these remnants in the archives. Although I'm convinced there's some still in some attics and other places in New England and London. But so what happens here is that Christian Barnes becomes very enthused about her pet project, as he becomes, of cultivating his talent. And she calls him her Black Hogarth, which of course is a reference to William Hogarth, the famous 18th century artist who's famous around the British Empire because his paintings are turned into prints and sold everywhere at an inexpensive price. And Christian Barnes is very enamored of Prince Demah's talent. She says he's the most surprising instance of the force of natural genius because without any instruction or improvement, he's taken a copy of my face, which is what you see here, which I think has more of my resemblance than Copley's. And he's now taking his own face. So this is amazing that he could do this with, the training that he received either just from other creative people in the maritime community. A lot of sailors are engaged in things like decorating wooden and ivory pieces, for example. We're not sure how he got to hone his talent, but this is what he was able to do. And this is one of the reasons why she is inspired, again, all at the urging of Daphne, who really sets this situation in motion, to have Prince sent to London to have professional training. Now, Prince is sent on a ship, of course, with Henry Barnes. The two of them set sail. Prince works his way across the Atlantic because he was a sailor for years. And so he pays his own way across the Atlantic. And once they get to London, Henry Barnes finds a man to train him. He finds this man, Mr. Pine, who takes him purely on account of his genius, as Henry Barnes puts it. Robert Edge Pine doesn't even charge to train Prince Demah. And I think that this is because he is excited at his possibility. I think it is also, as I'll go into in detail in just a minute, because he also is of African heritage. And I think that they have this shared heritage which inspires him to train him. But so this is kind of astonishing because Prince Demah, one of the reasons that he goes to London to get training is that John Singleton Copley in Boston refuses to train him because of his race. And then I think one of the reasons Robert Edge Pine agrees to train him in London is because of his race, but also because of his genius. Now, there's no other instance that we know of a colonial artist being sent to London to get professional training. So this already is a very unusual story. But I think one that highlights the fact that this is not, he's not the only Black creative genius who goes to London. Phillis Wheatley, of course, does the same thing, and she does it just a few months after Prince Demah comes back. So she's a poet, not a painter, but I'm going to talk more about their connections in a minute. But so one of the things that Henry Barnes was worried about was that even though this is an extraordinary story and Prince Demah is one of, very few colonial Bostonian people who were enslaved who gets sent to London to further his career, by which I mean him and Phillis Wheatley, London is filled with black people. There are probably about 5,000, the estimates are about 5,000 people of African descent in London in this time, which is 1770 to 1771. And there is a vibrant free black community. There is a lot of agitation among the black community and their allies for the abolition of slavery. This is only a few months before a famous landmark British court case called Somerset versus Stewart is going to decide that it is not okay for black people in England to be involuntarily shipped off to slavery across the Atlantic. And this is then something that Americans who are in London worry that their enslaved people will sort of get infected, as they saw it, by this spirit of liberty of the free black London community and self-emancipate, run away from slavery. And in fact, Henry Barnes is worried about this with Prince Demah. He writes back home that he does not let Prince Demah converse with anyone of his own color. So this is ironic in part because, as I mentioned, Robert Edge Pine was likely of African descent. There's some documentary evidence for this. There also is this visual evidence. This is his father, John Pine, in a portrait by William Hogarth, and which makes it extra ironic that Christian Barnes refers to Prince Demah as her Black Hogarth, because Prince Demah, when training with Robert Edge Pine, almost certainly would have seen a print of his teacher's father hanging in the Pine household, and made that connection to Hogarth himself. And so one of the reasons that Hogarth is, in addition to John Pine's features and hair, is showing that he's of African descent, is that he's engaging this long iconography of showing people of African descent with turbans and or pearls. On the right, you see an image by William Hogarth from one of his famous print series. And you can see that this is a sort of troublesome, racially stereotyped image, and I'm going to go into that more near the end of the talk, that Hogarth made, unlike the sympathetic portrait of his good friend John Pine. But notice that the young boy has the single pearl earring and the turban. And then on the left, you see a much more lovely, sympathetic portrayal of a black servant with the turban and the pearl earring, in this case, a print by Robert Edge Pine himself. And so this is one of the things that is so intriguing, is that these artists of African descent end up working together in London as part of this vibrant London art community. And when Prince Demah ends up in London working with Robert Edge Pine, he ends up in St. Martin's Lane. And this is a watercolor of St. Martin's Lane, part of it. And if you look at the top right, you'll see a man in a window. That is either Robert Edge Pine himself or his next door artist neighbor, because he lived in one of the first two houses there. And St. Martin's Lane bustled with artists and artisans, women as well as men. Robert Edge Pine's wife was a portrait painter too, although not a single one of her portraits remains to us. This is also where Thomas Chippendale had his famous cabinet making shop. And St. Martin's Lane was widely acknowledged to be the sort of center of artistic production in London, in the whole British Empire, really. And so this is where Prince Demah, who's been a sailor for years and is one of only 5 enslaved people in the town of Marlborough, Massachusetts, finds himself training in 1770 to 1771. And imagine what this is like, to go from being forcibly taken from your mother as a young boy, made to serve as a sailor, which is obviously a dangerous and demanding job, and then by, against all odds, getting to train in London, but you get to train with a family of African descent that think you're a genius. What a change this is from his life in Marlborough, Massachusetts. And so here, I think, is where we can think too about other similarities that Prince Demah and his teacher Robert Edge Pine have, and that is their politics. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Prince Demah ends up enlisting to fight for the Patriots. He is attached to the Patriot cause. Robert Edge Pine, as it comes to play, is also attached to the American cause, even though he's British born, raised, and until 1783 has never set foot in America. 1784. But I think his early work, you see his politics on display already. And I think this is one of the reasons he agrees to train Prince Demah too, that he's a true egalitarian. So on the left, you see his portrait of Catherine Macaulay, who's the famous British female historian who corresponds with John Adams and Abigail Adams and George and Martha Washington. And American revolutionaries love her because she writes this 5-volume history of England that talks about the monarchy as not a great thing, not as radical as Thomas Paine, but kind of leaning in that direction. An American once had dinner with her in London during the Revolution, and she said that Charles I, the king who was decapitated, was bad, but George III was worse. So this is probably not true, by the way, but this is how her politics tilt. And so Americans loved her. And when they thought about what Catherine Macaulay, this female historian, looked like, they thought about this portrait that Robert Edge Pine painted of her in 1775. This was made into prints that circulated around the British Empire. It also was made into ceramics, like the one you see in the middle left there. What I love about this, and you can actually see this on Zoom, which is great, you usually can't see it in a bigger room, is that this is 1775. So this is the First Continental Congress. And what you see here is that they have this ceramics person, manufacturer, has copied Robert Edge Pine's portrait, but then at the very bottom, he's written the words American Congress. So deliberately linking the Republican ideas of Catherine Macaulay's Histories of Britain to the activities of the American Congress. Similarly, Robert Edge Pine painted this portrait on the top right of John Wilkes, who's the famous radical British politician who's jailed without habeas corpus being served him without due process because he suggests in writing that George III is not the son of George II, but is someone else's bastard instead, for which he's jailed. And the fact that he's jailed without habeas corpus being served absolutely outrages people around the British Empire. And he becomes, of course, this lightning rod that American revolutionaries like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams adore. And again, when people think of what John Wilkes looks like, they think of this Robert Edge Pine image more often than not. And it's interesting because he's made this famously ugly man look not as hideous as he usually does, which I think is political sympathies. And much like Catherine Macaulay's image, Robert Edge Pine circulates around the Atlantic, not just in prints, but here on the bottom right, you see him represented in a snuff box. So you could, take some tobacco and think about Wilkes and Liberty, which is an interesting statement about the 18th century. So this is the man that Prince Demah trains with in London. This man who, by the time he arrives, is already making, a nice amount of money, has a great reputation. He's won multiple prizes for his paintings. His work is inspiring other works of art, which is always a sign of success. And so this is where this enslaved man from Massachusetts finds himself training, in this family that shares his African descent, that shares his politics. But this raises the interesting question of whose politics influenced whose here, because it's kind of a chicken and the egg. Because when Prince Demah was training with Robert Edge Pine, this is one of the paintings he would have been working on. This is obviously not a painting. This is a print copy of a painting. In the Q&A, I can talk about why so few of Robert Edge Pine's paintings survive. They all go up in this fire in a really dramatic way. But so this is the painting that Pine was working on when Demah was training with him in London. And this is a famous, at the time, 13th century scene, which is the Earl of Warren, who's the one with his sword drawn on the right, who is protesting the fact that the evil King Edward, who's up there glowering on his throne, has seized his property without due process and is being a tyrannical king. So in 1771, when this painting was first exhibited, this sent quite a pointed political message, right? This is 1771, tyrannical king overreaching in terms of property, and what he's taking from people through taxation is a very clearly linked message to what's happening in the American colonies. And so what Prince Demah would have done with Robert Edge Pine, because this is how painters were trained in the 18th century, he would have been the one who was helping to paint the columns and the cloth that's surrounding the throne and the drapery across the king's body, where Robert Edge Pine would have done the faces. Because this then is a painting that is this enslaved man from Boston working with his London teacher, creating this painting that's talking about English constitutional liberties and kings who overstep. And I think that this is amazing to think about these two men who become deeply attached to the American cause of independence and liberty, working on this painting together and talking about its historical messages. It's even more interesting to think about that because Christian Barnes leaves records in her letters that she can't figure out what Prince Demah's politics are. She writes that she hopes he has Tory or Loyalist principles because he was born in their family, but she confesses to a friend, "Of that I'm not so certain, as he's not yet declared himself." So this is extraordinary for a couple of reasons. One is that Christian Barnes is wondering what her enslaved artist's politics are at all. So this tells you a lot about the complications of their relationship. But also, I think it speaks to the real savvy diplomacy that Prince Demah obviously has. Because as it turns out, of course, he is a patriot. And I think there's good reason, though, for him not to say what his politics are. Because the third person living in the household with Prince Demah and Daphne in Marlborough is a young woman called Juliet. Now, Juliet, for a long time when I was reading Christian Barnes's letters, I thought that Juliet was like a cousin or something, because the Barneses always had these young girls living with them. They were merchants. They trained, many of them were their distant relatives. They trained them up to work in the merchant shops with them in Massachusetts. And at first I thought Juliet was one of these people. But no, it turns out that Juliet is the third enslaved member of the household with the Demahs. And Christian Barnes writes that Juliet has fallen in love with another man in the neighborhood called Jack, who, as it turns out, also is enslaved. And that Jack is so infatuated that he has given up his love of Bacchus for his love of Venus. So I guess Juliet inspired him to give up drinking because he fell in love. And Christian Barnes just thinks that they're so charming and cute together, and she encourages them to get married. This is how she writes about it. Of course, enslaved people can't legally be married in 1770s Massachusetts, but she allows them to get married. She writes about how romantic this all is. Juliet is pregnant when she's giving birth to her first child. Christian Barnes puts her in the best room in the house. Daphne serves as midwife. But when the baby is born, Christian Barnes writes to a friend, evil sufficient to the day is the evil thereof, and that she's disposed of the child. Now, whether she has given the baby away or sold the baby away is unclear. Obviously, Juliet and Jack do not want this to happen, but Christian Barnes gives away their child. And then when Juliet becomes pregnant a second time, about a year or so on, when the baby is born, Christian Barnes again writes to this same friend that it is as she has feared, and the baby's complexion makes it clear that Jack is not the father. So reading between the lines there, this means that Juliet's second baby was fathered by a white man. Whether it's Henry Barnes or someone else, we do not know. But Christian Barnes is absolutely outraged by this, the fact that it's a white man's child and that Juliet has given birth again. And she says, Juliet and Jack have begged to stay together, which leads me to believe that it was obviously not a consensual sexual act that birthed this child. But Juliet and Jack have begged to stay together, but she won't listen to them. And this time she not only sells away or gives away Juliet's baby, but Juliet herself. And Juliet completely disappears from the record. So then you just have Prince Demah and his mother Daphne in the house. So you can imagine why Prince Demah did not feel comfortable sharing the fact that his politics were different from those of Christian Barnes. And Christian Barnes is, to me, the perfect example of how complicated people in the past were. On the one hand, I like her. She's witty, she's warm, she is an art patron, she goes the extra mile to get Prince training. But on the other hand, she does this to Juliet and her children. And so I think that this is a wonderful example of how complicated people are in the past, and how fraught a time period this was when you were sharing a household, enslaved and enslaver. But I do, as I said, think it points to Prince Demah's diplomatic skill and Daphne's diplomatic skill in not letting Christian Barnes know what their politics were. Because as it turns out, Christian and Henry Barnes are some of the staunchest loyalists around. So they refused to sign non-importation agreements. They kept selling British goods. And for this, they were vilified in Boston area newspapers, and eventually things take an ugly turn. So one day, people hang an effigy, their neighbors hang an effigy on a hill outside of their house in Marlborough, and there's a paper pinned to its breast that calls Henry an infamous importer. It hangs there all day, and then when night comes, they burn it. And later that same night, the neighbors steal a horse from a local stable. They put another effigy on its back with a paper pinned to it that says that they wish all the Barneses were in hell, and they tar and feather the effigy and the horse and set it loose around the town. Now, this is the only example that I've been able to find, or I've ever seen anyone find, of an animal being tarred and feathered to send a political message during the American Revolution. Patriots, of course, tar and feather loyalists, and they tar and feather British customs officials. But this is the only time I've heard about an animal. And if you can imagine what horsehair and tar would smell like and look like and feel like for the poor horse, and how absolutely terrifying this must have been to the Barneses to witness their neighbors going to these lengths to send them these threats of violence. And no doubt made a lasting impression. And in fact, I think it's a chilling reminder of the violence that is simmering below the surface of the American Revolution. Often through the art of the American Revolution, we tend to focus on things like Paul Revere's Boston Massacre print on the left, which is one of the best pieces of propaganda ever, because if only because you've watched John Adams' the miniseries, you know this is not how this went down. The British did not line up firing squad style and fire into the unarmed crowd of well-dressed men and boys. But this is how we tend to remember the American Revolution, as an event. If there is violence, it is very much limited to soldierly violence or to violence on the battlefields, and the patriots are almost never the perpetrators. But the patriots are the ones who tar and feather the horse. The patriots are also the ones who are responsible for that gash in Christian Barnes's chest. If you've been looking at her portrait wondering if Prince Demah just messed up there, he did not. What happened was, after the tarring and the feathering of the horse, a little bit of time went by, and then Christian Barnes was held up at gunpoint at the door of her house. She and Daphne were there, and this is sort of the last straw. And the Barneses leave in 1775. They leave Massachusetts, which is early. They leave Massachusetts in 1775. Daphne and Prince stay behind. They self-emancipate. In part, this is because Prince Demah has already set up as a professional portrait painter in Boston by this time. I'll get to that next. But when they leave, their property is confiscated by the Patriot government. And the Patriots, when they come to commandeer the house to give to Henry Knox and his wife Lucy, stab a bayonet through the hearts of the portraits to send a message. And I think this is a good reminder of that violence that is always simmering below the surface of the revolution and sometimes boils over. So one of the reasons I think that Prince Demah and his mother stay behind is because he has, by this point in time, by 1775, been working for at least 4 years as a professional painter. He takes out advertisements in the Boston newspapers as a black man whose extraordinary genius has been assisted by one of the best masters in London. He set up shop at the shop of a Boston watchmaker called John McLean, who would end up being a patriot as well. And it turns out that John McLean's shop is within shouting distance of where the Boston Massacre occurred, but also where Phillis Wheatley, the Black American poet, lives with her enslavers, the Wheatleys, also within shouting distance of these sites. And so here I would like to suggest that I think Prince Demah, even though it's not recognized as such, I think he's the one who painted the portrait of Phillis Wheatley that becomes turned into the print that gets put in the frontispiece of her famous book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. Like Prince Demah, Phillis Wheatley could not get the financial backing or creative training that she needed in Boston. And like him, and about 6 months after he returned, she went to London to get her book published and to get the patronage for it. And I find it hard to believe that the fact that it's usually assumed that this young boy, Scipio Moorhead, who is the subject of the poem that inspired the title of my book, To S.M., the young African artist, on first seeing his works. It's usually assumed that Scipio Moorhead made the painting because Phillis Wheatley wrote that poem. However, I think the idea that the Wheatleys, including Phillis herself, who was very careful about her appearance and her what we would call PR today, would not have chosen the man who was trained by one of the best teachers in London and advertising that fact and a few blocks away, and instead would have chosen the neighbor boy who'd never been professionally trained as a painter. This to me just makes no sense. There also are some visual similarities. You can look at the portrait of Christian Barnes here and the portrait of Phillis Wheatley, and then if you cast your mind back to William Duguid, there's some similarities to how the furniture and books, etc., are done. The fact is, we'll never know for sure, probably, whether Prince Demah or Scipio Moorhead painted Phillis Wheatley's portrait. The reason I like to emphasize it, in addition to just talking about the importance of Prince Demah, is to think about the fact that sometimes we talk about Black people who are creative geniuses as if they're sort of one-offs. And, you know, especially in Black History Month, I think it's so important for us to remember that someone like Phillis Wheatley or someone like Prince Demah, they're extraordinary, but they're not unique. So whether it was Scipio Moorhead or it was Prince Demah who painted Phillis Wheatley's portrait, what we have in this portrait and thinking about its making is the fact that you have not one, not two, but three enslaved Black creative geniuses living within shouting distance of one another in Boston. And so I really think we need to stop talking about Black people who are talented and creative as if they are unique, because they're not. There are many creative, talented Black people who, like Phillis Wheatley and like Prince Demah, despite the overwhelming odds of the structural oppression of slavery, still managed to create these important works of art that have a lot of political purpose during the American Revolution as well. So the last thing I'll say about Prince Demah is that he unfortunately did not get to do his art as long as we might have hoped he would. He enlisted to fight for the Massachusetts militia after his enslavers fled for first Nova Scotia, then Britain. And he enlisted in a Massachusetts artillery unit called the Train. And the second in command of the Train was Paul Revere, who you see here. The first in command was a man who worked as a Japanner, so creating furniture like the thing on the left that is in imitation of Japanese lacquer-style furniture, for example. And that man's name was Colonel Thomas Crafts. And Crafts was the man who read the Declaration of Independence out loud when it was first read out loud in Boston. So this is a regiment that Prince Demah enlists in that is filled with other men who make their living as artisans, just as he does. Revere is a silversmith, Crafts is a Japanner, and Demah is a limner or a portrait painter. There's another officer, Joseph Dunkerley, who paints miniatures, and you see one of his miniatures on the right, surrounded by a frame made by Paul Revere, the second in command. And what I love about Joseph Dunkerley is he's a reminder of the fact that the American Revolution is transatlantic in nature, and that Prince Demah would have found people willing and eager to talk to him about his time in London, even within this artillery unit in Massachusetts. Because Joseph Dunkerley, the miniaturist, was someone who came to Massachusetts because he was enlisted in the British Army. And when the Declaration of Independence was publicized, he became so inspired by the ideals of liberty and equality that he deserted the British Army and enlisted in the Massachusetts militia and ended up spending the rest of his life in America. So this is interesting because Prince Demah, I think not accidentally, ends up in this regiment with all of these artisans in it and all of these artisan officers. Of course, he is not an officer because there are no Black officers in the American Revolution. But he's one of thousands of Black men, enslaved and free, who do pick up and fight on behalf of the American Revolution. And when he dies, sadly, in 1778, probably from smallpox, he writes a will and he leaves all of his possessions to his, quote, beloved mother, Daphne Demah. And he proudly proclaims himself to be Prince Demah of Boston, in the county of Suffolk, and in the Massachusetts state limner. So he announces that he is an artist at the end of his life. And as I mentioned, he's one of only thousands of black men who fight for the patriot cause. On the far left, you see in a 1783 watercolor, or 1781 watercolor rather, sorry, a member of Rhode Island's first regiment. And I think that his story demands that we think not just about Prince Demah as an artist, but Prince Demah as a soldier and Prince Demah as representative. We know he did a self-portrait, it's lost to time, but Prince Demah is a way for us to think about how Black people have been portrayed in art as well as created art, and why that is something that we need to think about today as well as in the American Revolutionary era. Um, so the last thing I'll say before I end on that note is to note that Robert Edge Pine, whose painting called America you see here, he created this in 1778, the same year that Prince Demah died. And I often wondered if he and Prince Demah corresponded during the war, because this painting got Robert Edge Pine rather in a lot of trouble in England. It's a painting that essentially says America is bringing peace and plenty to the world, and Britain is responsible for keeping it away from the world. And he gets it financed in part through one of George Washington's best friends from Virginia, who's living in England at the time. And you see his agreement to finance on the right there. And so Robert Edge Pine, after Prince Demah's death and after the war is done, comes to America. And he paints this picture of George Washington, which you see on the left. He paints some portraits at Mount Vernon, which you see on the right. He also opens America's first grand art museum. And one of Charles Wilson Peele's, 83 Children says it best. He said, "When I entered Mr. Pine's saloon, I was astonished at its magnitude and the richness of the paintings which covered its walls." This was a bespoke mansion that Robert Morris created for Robert Edge Pine. It included all of his massive history paintings, like the one that he and Prince Demah worked on together in London in 1770 and 1771. It included things like this Shakespearean scene, The Fate of Ophelia. When Houdon, the French sculptor, brought his bust of Franklin, he left it at Robert Edge Pine's museum. The reason I emphasize this is Prince Demah's hands had a part in creating some of this art as well, and the family certainly knew him. And so traces of his life are found in this first great American art museum as well. And so I'd like to conclude by saying that the fact that Prince Demah as an artist, Phillis Wheatley as an artist, and the fact that Black people as subjects of paintings are not given their historical or art historical due is something that I think we continue to need to think about as people, as Americans, because one of the most famous images of another Black soldier like Prince Demah, another patriot soldier in the American Revolution, is William Lee, who was George Washington's enslaved valet by his side throughout the Revolution, famous for riding a horse by his side. You see him here in his iconic image as painted by John Trumbull, who, like Prince Demah, trained in London, was a colonist who trained in London to paint. And the reason I emphasize this almost certainly is not what William Lee looked like. William Lee was someone who was known to people like Trumbull because he lived with Washington throughout the war, probably was in his tent alongside him, took care of his clothing, watched over his papers, was renowned as a horseman of great talent, was notably by his side during pivotal moments in the war. And yet John Trumbull has chosen to show him in this stereotyped way that William Hogarth and many, many others show Black people in art in the 18th century, with these sort of exaggerated figures, orientalized figures, using things like turbans and pearl earrings to symbolize their African heritage. William Lee did wear a uniform that was blue with red trim. He never wore a turban. This is something Trumbull puts in there to create this sort of African stereotype that plays into ideas about Black people, that infantilizes them through art and that diminishes their accomplishments through art. And in fact, I think this is something that you can see that Robert Edge Pine is doing slightly differently in his portrait, because his figure here with the turban and the pearls is much more sympathetically painted. I have another piece coming out that argues that the real William Lee is the man you see in this Peale painting, who is holding Washington's horse Nelson. And I think you can see that this is a portrait of a mixed race man, as William Lee was known to be. And the reason I mention this is because, when we go to places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, why does it matter that we recognize that there are Black creative geniuses like Prince Demah who are among the artists, and that William Lee, who was freed by Washington in his will because of his service during the Revolutionary War, are shown in these, infantilized, stereotyped ways rather than in ways that reflect their humanity and their individuality. And I think it plays into why we still need Black History Month, because these stories are very often left out of history still, unfortunately. And they are the art that shows Black people in the stereotyped, racialized fashion. We see evidence of that continuing to today. And I think that it's something that we need to think about the reparative work of making sure that Black people are folded into our national story, just as they have been fighting to create this nation, whether it's through art or arms, since the very beginning. And that's one of the things I hope people take away from this book, The Painter's Fire, is that Prince Demah and his mother and Phillis Wheatley are examples of how diverse our founding era was, and the fact that it was a diverse group of patriots who put this country together, just as it's a diverse group of Americans helping to keep it alive ever since. So thank you so much for letting me tell you about Prince Demah and his mother and their extraordinary lives. And thank you for your time.